All rise. Vous ouvrirez. The International Criminal Court is in session. L'audience de la Cour pénale internationale est ouverte. Please be seated. We use the swap.
Good morning, everyone. Could the court officer please call the case?
Good morning, Mr. President and your honors. Situation in Uganda in the case of the prosecutor versus Dominic Ongwen, case reference ICC 0204-0115, and for the record, we are in open session.
Thank you. I ask for the appearances of the parties. Ms. Adwoyejo.
Good morning, Your Honor. Adeshola Adeboyejo appears for the prosecution with Mr. Benjamin Gumpert, Colin Black, Colleen Gilg, Betty Holler, Yulia Nusban, Nikki Lakachish, and Grace Go.
And then for the legal representatives of the victims, Mr. Manoba.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. Myself, Joseph Manoba, Francisco Cox, Ms. Raziowska Maria, Priscilla Alain at the back, and Ms. Listowell Atto.
Thank you. And for the common legal representatives, Ms. Masida.
Mr. President, for the Common Legal Representative Team, Orcholona Narantsetsek, Caroline Walter, and I am Paulina Masida.
Thank you. And now for the defense.
Mr. President, I hope to do better today. Today I'm assisted by Chief Charles Acheleke Tako, Beth Leons, Kifude Gordon, Thomas Oboff, Morgane Ashley, and our client, Mr. Dominic Ongwen, is in court.
Thank you very much. As we are all aware of, today we hear the closing statements of the representatives of the victims. We start in the first session with the legal representatives of the victims. In the second session, the so-called common legal representatives. And I give first Mr. Manoba the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and your honors, for this opportunity to present statements on behalf of the victims that we represent. Your honors, I will start with a quote, and quotes are going to be a very significant feature of our statements this morning. Some of the quotes you may wish to know might be a little bit longer, but this is intentional because the quotes, we believe, speak and represent a number of concerns and views by our clients. And I start, they entered into the camp. We started running. We hid in a hole. There are about 6 of us hiding in that ditch. My neighbor and people from my household. While we were in that ditch, we were quiet because there were gunshots, and the people who were firing the gunshots had surrounded us. One girl, wife to one of the rebels, slipped. She slipped and she was about to fall into the ditch. When she slipped, she shone her torch into the ditch. When she shone her torch into the ditch, she saw us and she shouted, "The enemy is here. There is a soldier here." When she shouted that there is a soldier here, there's a number of people, about 30 rebels, who bore arms. They came and they surrounded the ditch. When they surrounded the ditch, they said, "Is there a soldier amongst you?" My father responded and said, "No, it's only civilians. There is no soldier." The rebel responded, "If you are all civilians, come out of the ditch." I was the first one to come out of the ditch. They took me out first. I was pushed out of the ditch. They told me to lie down on my stomach. When I lay down, they took me and sent me to another direction where there were other people. When I came out, they sent me to another group of people. The neighbor and the people I listed earlier were all taken out. The neighbor was killed instantly. My brother was also killed. Immediately, excuse me, immediately thereafter, I got up, I left. I left Abok as well. When I left Abok, I was still very young. They had a sack of beans, approximately 4 basins full. They told me to carry that on my head and move with it. But I was very young and I did not have the strength to carry that. I did try, but they took it. They carried that and put it on my head and told me to start moving. They shot my father when he had come out of the ditch. My neighbor came out, my father came out, and that's when they were shot. The person who was standing with the neighbor was shot as soon as they came out of the ditch. The person who was standing with my father shot him immediately. He noticed that the neighbor had been shot. My other brother was taken. They walked with him for a short distance. Not very far from that ditch, they told him to lie down and they shot him. When I left with them, I knew that those people had already lost their lives. End of quote. If this story or quote sounds familiar, it is because it is the account of P280 who testified before this court concerning the attack on Abok. This testimony, Your Honors, speaks to many of the other experiences in the camps in Lukodi and Odek, where our clients hail from. P280, as the chamber would be aware, is also a victim represented by the LRVs in this case. And his account, while disconcerting, is sadly too familiar. P280, as the chamber would be aware also, is also a victim that we have had the honor to represent, and his story of loss and devastation is one that a significant number of our clients have experienced, as I had indicated earlier. The trial of Mr. Ongwen, therefore, marks the beginning of a significant phase of recovery from a dark past. A past tainted with memories of atrocities committed predominantly by the LRA fighters against an already vulnerable civilian population. As we heard from the closing statements from the prosecution yesterday, Mr. Ongwen was a significant player and author of some of the worst crimes in northern Uganda, and in particular in the locations of Odek, Lukodi, Abok, and Pajule IDP camps. Mr. Ongwen and the LRA benefited and drank from what we would term as the spoils of the armed conflict, and left behind broken individuals and shattered communities, destroyed all sources of basic human living and sustenance, resulting in life of deprivation. Their acts of terror created memories of the lives of loved ones wasted in burning houses, shot down with bullets, and others battered to death in barbaric fashion, as though bloodshed and life were meaningless. A history of productive life replaced by a revolting life of squalor in the IDP camps. Your Honors, the African child who was the source of hope and a transformative future, replaced with a life of illiteracy, frustration, misery, envy, alcoholism, and land conflicts, amongst others. This past is one which the victims that we represent do not wish to see again, and would not survive if it were to reoccur. It is the victims' hope that through this trial their experiences have been heard, and Mr. Ongwen is and will be held responsible for his actions and omissions as an LRA fighter and commander, as we heard from the prosecution yesterday. And this trial can be a great message to all those outside there who wish to act in the same way that Mr. Ongwen and others may have acted, that tolerance and love for peace and togetherness can be achieved without resorting to violence and or committing atrocities in society. For the public, Your Honors, the victims with status before this court are represented by us because we were granted participation rights, or the victims were granted participation rights in which they were allowed access to the case record. They were allowed to make filings and respond to filings of the other parties and participants. With leave of the chamber, question witnesses presented by the parties and participants, and also attend the proceedings as we have done. It is on this basis that the LRVs and team members have identified specific areas of the trial of Mr. Ongwen that they wish to address in these closing statements. And I will address the first two parts, which are victims' expectations before this case and life in the camp and its impact on social fabric. And my colleague, Francisco, will address the other parts of our statement. I now turn to the first part, victims' expectations before the case. Your Honors, before the commencement of the proceedings against Dominic Ongwen, most victims had resigned themselves to the outlook that there would be no justice in their lifetime for the grave violations that they had endured during the course of the conflict between the UPDF and the LRA in northern Uganda. It had been more than a decade between the referral of the situation in Uganda to the ICC and the arrest of Mr. Ongwen. During this time, 3 of the 5 LRA suspects under investigation were reported to have been killed in the bush, and the other 2 had remained elusive. In this period, Your Honors, a significant number of victims would die from the misery of the aftermath of the crimes, with no hope of justice and accountability for the indignity that characterized their lives as a result of the conflict. Our clients recall that for a time, it appeared as though none of the top LRA commanders indicted by this court would be brought to account for their actions until they heard and or watched on Ugandan radio and television that Dominic Ongwen had been apprehended in the Central African Republic, thereby reopening the potential for justice to be realized for the first time in the history of the armed conflict in northern Uganda. The victims were eager to be involved in a process that would seek to establish the truth about whether or not Mr. Dominic Ongwen was responsible for the crimes that were committed against them. The legal representatives for victims in this case have had the honor of representing over 2,600 victims of the crimes that were subject of these proceedings, crimes for which Mr. Dominic Ongwen has been charged. Your Honors, we would wish to state that there are many other victims who have expressed and continue to express their desire to be part of this justice process. It is noteworthy from our engagement with the participating victims that they have never been interested in finding a scapegoat. The victims have been principally interested in a process that seeks to establish the truth. Was Mr. Ongwen responsible for the crimes committed against them? And if so, how? For the victims, the process of truth-telling was and remains essential to their understanding of what amounts to justice in this context. The victims, while confident in the capacity of the prosecution to present its case, remain open to the deliberations and contestation of the facts through the trial process, appreciating that it would be through this process that the truth would be ascertained. The victims we represent, Your Honors, suffered the devastating effects of the attacks on the IDP camps in Odek, in Lukodi, and Abok. As you have heard several accounts of witnesses that have testified here, some were abducted and forced to engage in the criminal actions of the LRA, while others were given as wives to the LRA soldiers who repeatedly raped them. The charges therefore brought against Mr. Ongwen for the attack on each of these locations reflects the experiences of harm suffered by the participating victims. Through the judicial process, the victims have been keen to observe the extent to which the evidence would retell the story of their suffering at the hands of the LRA. The victims have also been keen to discover if and to what extent Mr. Ongwen was responsible for the crimes. I will now turn to the second part of our statement, which is life in the camp and its impact on social fabric. Your Honors, the victims recall how severely the situation had deteriorated, forcing them to leave their homes, farms, and for majority, their entire livelihoods in order to seek some degree of safety in the IDP camps, which would be protected by the UPDF forces. What we're saying, Your Honors, is that because of the insecurity that the LRA created within all these locations, it was pertinent for the victims to find a place which would promise some level, some degree of security. And this is the IDP camps, as we have heard before this court. The living conditions in the camps were not only very harsh and challenging, but quite different from how they traditionally lived before the conflict. In the camps, diseases became common due to the lack of proper health and sanitary conditions. There were little sources of income, and people merely depended on support from humanitarian agencies to get the little food and basic supplies. Having been previously self-sufficient, the victims struggled to find means to sustain themselves while in the camp. As P24 noted concerning the situation in Lukodi IDP camp, and I quote, "We could not grow crops because there were so many within the villages they had killed, so many people. And even when they killed people, they did not disperse at all. So the government decided to send some soldiers to help us reach our farms. If you are not lucky, sometimes they follow you up to the edge of the camp. For that reason, we were not able to access our farms. All our crops, including cassava, was consumed by them. We were staying like that in a manner that was not human. There was no space for keeping animals such as goats and cattle. We thought we would stay well in the camp. Unfortunately, it became a problem. Your Honors, the gravity of the life in the camps by the victims is again captured in the testimony of D26 in response to a question put to him by the presiding judge when he explained, and I quote, "So, Mr. President, first of all, these IDP camps were crowded together without defined structures for homes, maybe houses, and the kind of materials people were using for making their small huts, tarpaulins, if you find one, a bit of grass, if you find, because it was difficult also to find grasses. You couldn't move out and find grasses. And the spaces were too concentrated and very small. So the human condition, first of all, the housing wasn't there. What was there, I don't know how to call it, how to define it, because it was deplorably bad and the people were too many. So it was so bad in terms of housing. In terms of feeding, there were no foods. Remember, people were being forced out to leave their home and come in the camp without carrying things or food. Remember, there were no distribution of food by government. There were also at the beginning, there was nothing from NGOs until when some of us came in, and with very few NGOs, actually in Lango region, very few NGOs went there because of restriction and little knowledge about the situation there. So there was a lot of malnutrition in the camps. Children, babies, the elderly, the disabled would die as expressed by the witness like a one-day-old chick. So in terms of feeding, there was a lot of problem, which caused a lot of malnutrition, and many children died as a result of that. Secondly, hygiene and sanitation, my area of specialization. I was the water and sanitation officer. It took us about 2 months to do 2 to 3 months to do hygiene and health education first, to try to train people how they could manage waste, human waste. There were no latrines, but you're talking of 30,000 people. And he continues to say, so the sanitation was terribly bad, and many people caught other diseases and died as a result of poor hygiene and sanitation. Illness like diarrhea, cholera, typhoid, and what those things you couldn't avoid. It was just a normal thing that people have to get it and they have to die because there were also no medical facilities. Nothing. And again, in the camps, it was now very risky for people who were in the camp. If you want to move out, you are not sure whether you go out and come back. It was even more risky for them to be in the camp because you are not very sure whether you are going home and you will come back. So people were just there now, dying painfully or suffering painfully as they were in the camp. That's why many people were not very comfortable in the camp. But they had no option. So life in the camp was really bad. So many people died as a result of the poor and deplorable situation in the camps. Your Honors, this statement by D26, a defense witness, tells you the experiences of the victims as they lived in the IDP camps. Thank you for listening to me, and I'll invite my colleague to continue with our statements.
Thank you, Your Honors.
Mr. Manoba, your microphone.
The consequences of crime have been lasting for our victims and the people we represent. The Chamber has heard significant evidence regarding the harm suffered by victims as a result of these crimes for which Mr. Dominic Ongwen is charged. The key source of such evidence include evidence of the 3 participating victims called by the LRB, evidence given by a large number of other victims who were called as witnesses, either by the defense or by the OTP. The expert evidence that was provided and introduced by this team, and the expert evidence provided and given by the common legal representative. What are the consequences? One of these consequences is the separation and lasting harm to family relationships due to abduction. As evidence has shown, where people were abducted by the LRA, a significant form of harm was caused by separation of families. For the family members of the abductee, this is almost an inevitable cause of significant worry and distress. Parents are still, until today, suffering from the anguish of not knowing the fate of their children. Each time an abductee would return, families would go to this person and seek information of their families, see if they had seen their children, know the fate of their children. This anguish is still occurring. But not only the family left behind suffers pain, the abductee also suffers great anxiety about the unknown fate of their family members. For children, this separation also removes their first line of support and protection, which ordinarily comes from family. They are eager to know how their parents are doing. How are their siblings? Did they suffer the same fate as they did? And always longing for their family and community. But you must remember, Your Honors, that some abductee victims were forced to kill members of their own family or even of their own communities. Just think for a moment the consequences of these actions and what effect they have upon the relationship of a family and the community. Nevertheless, many abductees returned to their families and communities. Unfortunately, some returned to family members whom they felt they no longer knew. Others described how the relationship with their family members could never be repaired because of their abduction. We probably all remember the story of B2, a witness that the chamber authorized to testify for the LRB. This testimony is exemplary of what I'm trying to say. After returning from the bush, his family welcomed him home and tried to help him return to normal life, but they also feared him. B2 described how the first day he met his father, again, they sat through a whole night awake and watching each other, scared of each other. Although things have improved with time, their relationship remained permanently changed. He experienced episodes of extreme anger, which began after his return from the bush. And this has meant that his family continues to fear him. Speaking of his father, he said, and I quote, "Before my abduction, we had a very strong and good relationship. We stayed together. We would converse, and chat. But after my return, I think he looked at me or was studying me and felt that my mind had changed. I was not the same person as I was before, so he started fearing me." B2 is now a father himself, and yet when he spoke of his relationship with his children, he noted, "And up until now, our children, even the older ones and the young ones, fear me. If anything happens, any slightly thing happens, they just, have that fear of me." Within the communities affected by the crimes, neither the parents nor the guardians were provided with sufficient training or guidance on how to deal with the behavior of returned children, or how to react appropriately when these children showed signs of anger. Another last consequence of the crimes is stigma. Returnees were called names, prevented from playing with other children, or generally kept distance from their community. This stigmatization led to returnees dropping out of school, or to perform poorly when they tried to continue with their education. You may recall, once again, the vivid testimony of witness B2, who after enduring name-calling and shunning from his fellow students, was persuaded by his head teacher to open up and tell him about his experience in the bush. In confidence, in secrecy, he thought, only to have this confidence betrayed when the head teacher spoke openly before the entire school about the victim's experience. B2 would after that be chased from school, and the next day the head teacher advised all the students in the school assembly to stay away from B2 because he was a killer. B2 explained to your honors how this impacted his further study. He said, "I went to class to continue study, but I wasn't paying attention anymore. I built a wall around myself and secluded myself. I wouldn't even write whatever was on the chalkboard." B2 family tried him and moved him to a new school, but his stigmatization continued there. Eventually, he could no longer bear to attend school either. Another witness, P252, spoke about how he was stigmatized once he managed to escape from the LRA. He stated that other children would call him names, and therefore it was extremely difficult for him to return to school. The causes for exclusion of those that returned came from various factors. Communities were fearful that returnees had been infected by evil spirits, or Chen, that they had killed while in the bush. Some feared that they could continue to kill, that they were prone to violence. In some, they were scared of returnees, and returnees suffered deeply from the isolation and stigma that was cast upon them. Women and girls returning from the bush who had a child had to bear a special burden and were specially discriminated against. And some, even just for the fact of being abducted and being a woman or a girl, were stigmatized and or excluded. P352 stated that she faced stigma from her community, her family, and her husband's family after returning from the bush. Girls or women who escaped and brought back their children from the bush were subject to particular stigma and isolation. You may remember P422, who explained the difficulties for women and girls who returned from the bush with children, since they were viewed, the children, as the children of LRA commanders. P422 further stated that these women have difficulties forming and managing stable relationships. This was confirmed by P187, who explained that her daughter married after returning from the bush, but on discovering the husband that she was pregnant as a result of her time in the LRA, her husband left her. P269 explained, one of my colleagues came back with children from the bush. The first problem comes from man with whom you remarry. During your courtship days, he would tell you that he's ready to take care of everything that you have, including your child. But after remarriage, would turn around and reject such a child. And this leaves the children without anyone to live. They normally go back to their grandparents to live, but the grandparents do not have capacity to take care of them. Those who are now growing up do not have any property, do not have lands to inherit, they don't have anything. She's speaking about the children that were brought from the bush. Another consequences of the crime is the loss of education. Through a variety of means, the crimes interfered with the victim's education. Children who were abducted by the LRA suffered the most direct effect on their education. Their psychosocial problems made it difficult for children to readjust to the behavior expected by teachers or students. As said before, stigma caused children to drop out of school or prevented them to probably engaging with their education. You might also recall the testimony given by the professor, B3, who explained the abduction of children is particular. Some of the children who were abducted on their way back, some of them passed through rehabilitation centers. Some of them did not have the opportunity to directly go to these centers. They would go back home and stay home. The children who went through the rehabilitation center, some of these children were counseled. They were advised on how to enter back into the community. But the children who did not go through rehabilitation centers, and especially the children who had been in the bush for a long time, had misbehaved a lot. Because on most of occasions, the children would come and mix, the ones from the rehabilitation centers and the ones that did not go to the rehabilitation centers. And if somebody, especially someone from the bush, did something that was wrong, they were always castigated, the child. And they would tell the person, do not start your behavior that you brought in the bush. And that was extremely painful to those children who had returned. I continue with the quote because I think it's graphic of what happened to many children and many of our victims. And in the end, those children became disrespectful, and when they found that life was extremely difficult, they would stop school. They would just stop their education because of, as far as they are concerned, the school was unable to help them, and they would decide to go back home. And this actually disrupted a lot of education for children. There are some children who were abducted, for example. The girls, some of them came back with children. Some of them did not have children, but they are no longer interested in education. So this also interferes with their education. With our children in this part of the country. End of the quote. However, the loss of education system and opportunity was not the form of harm only suffered by abductees and returnees. The entire school system of northern Uganda suffered serious damages as a result of the LRA's activities, including the crimes charged. The experience of Lukodi Primary School, of which witness B3 testified, is an example. From 2002, the school was suffering because LRA attacks. Students and teachers were often unable to travel to school because of LRA activity, or only managed to attend late. Children and teachers alike faced difficult living conditions, including having to sleep in the bush at night without light so as to hide from rebels, meaning that teachers could not prepare for classes and children could not do homework. The LRA would attack the school, stealing supplies and abducting people to help them carry food. Eventually, as you might remember, it was decided to relocate the school to a location on the outskirts of Gulu town in Lalija, I hope I pronounced that correctly, which is around 14 to 15 kilometers from Lukodi. Conditions in Lalija were extremely challenging. Classroom ordinarily used for Lalija Primary School was now shared an additional 5 other schools. They moved 5 schools to 1 school, including Lukodi Primary School. The result was a classroom which was intended to accommodate around 50 pupils, was now accommodating 150 to 200, 1 classroom. With students sitting on the floor in the heat, in conditions so crowded that the teacher could not walk among them. Outside of their classes, the student continued to face the challenges. They had been sent to live in Lalija because of it perceived a relatively safe place, but often parents remained in Lukodi to work and produce food. Many children were looked after by siblings, with only visits from their parents when security conditions allowed it. In these conditions, children's education suffered from inability to focus on their education and lack of parental protection. They did not have time to study, and many girls dropped out or married as a result of pregnancy. Even when Lukodi was able to return to its original location, it faced many more obstacles. The school grounds and buildings had been largely destroyed and its movable property stolen or scattered. Even students began to report problems because of Chen. Academic records maintained by school show the devastating consequences that all these factors have had on the students' learning, not only at the time of the conflict, but for many years after and until now. The lasting nature of poor educational outcome is also confirmed by victim expert study, which found negative effects on education, also in relation to children born after the attacks charged in this case. This might be explained by various factors. One could be the lasting damage to the well-being of students in the community. Children who are at risk of psychological problems, stigmatization, have less capacity for doing schools. This applies also to the children who are at risk because of their vulnerability, how vulnerable they are, or stigmatization. In addition, other factors such as lasting material harm done to children's family members, disabilities preventing other family members from working, can result in children dropping out of school in order to contribute to the household. For example, P24 explained that none of the children in her household are attending school, and that she cannot afford for them to go to school. Other witnesses also testify about their families' poor economic circumstances led for their children to drop out of school. Other losses suffered by the crimes charged in this case is the loss of homes and personal property, including livestock. Many victims reported suffering terrible material losses as a result of crime. In the attacks on Lukodi, Abok, and Odek IDP camps, most of the huts were burned. The rebels systematically burned each house after looting it. All personal items which people kept in those huts were either stolen or burned. Nothing survived. Communities' livestock, one of the primary sources of wealth, was looted. As you heard from many witnesses, livestock plays a key role in the lives of family and community, as well as being a source of food and or a means of farming. These animals are used for traditional rituals, marriage, and economic transactions. As P306 informed this court, livestock, especially cattle, was very useful in the community, he said. It was used for paying bride wealth. It is used for plowing. It is used as a source of beef. You also use the cattle to pay school fees because you sell and you pay with them. When you are sick, you sell your livestock to get treatment. Things like goats, for example, help also in the same way. Goats are used for helping treat people in so many ways. There are some conditions like madness. They use goat in a traditional way to heal it, and for rituals that are culturally important for the community. They use goats to carry outside rituals. When there are funerals that are taking place in the community, the guests are fed on goats and cattle. And for that matter, this was an important element in the culture of Acholi, economically and socially. This is what 306 conveyed to you, Your Honors. This loss of material wealth has had a long-lasting impact on the communities. They have still not recovered today. B4, a community leader, explained in this court, and I quote, "Our people are poor these days because of the various situations that people live in. In past, people had livestock, people had cattle, people had goats, chickens, and other things. But all these things have been taken away, and it's not easy to gain back. For me, as an example, I had cattle, I had goats, I had worked hard, but now I'm not able to farm enough resources to farm and raise enough resources to buy livestock. People are desperately living in a poor condition." This is what B4 testified here. It is probably hard to grasp the magnitude of the harm when one lives in a place like this or where we live. But cattle, goats, chicken, is a fundamental asset for people, our represented victims. There's also physical and psychosocial consequences from the crimes. For a very large number of victims, continuing physical injuries and psychosocial problems interfere with their day life. The victim expert study presented by Dr. Teddy Yatim assessed victims' present-day level of disability. She defined it as a substantial functional limitation of daily activities caused by a physical, mental, or emotional impairment and environmental barriers that result in limiting a person's participation. The study found that around 2/3 of the victims we represent reported having a disability. This compares only with 21% of the general population who reported a disability. More than half of those disabled individuals reported that their disability either completely prevented them from working or interferes a lot with their work. Thank you. Witness P24 described her continuing injuries caused by the crimes and how they impact her daily life to this day. And I quote once again, "Even before coming here, I was from the hospital. My ears still disturb me. I have pain in my ears all the time. I'm not able to work. I cannot go to do my farm work because I find my body is aching all the time. I cannot walk for long distances. My ears keep aching also, and I have to struggle with it like that. I am not able to dig with ease, but I have no option. I go and dig a little. I cannot dig for long like my colleagues do. I just do what I can and stay home." Not only physical, but also psychosocial problems interfere with the victim's ability to continue an economically and socially productive life. Before explained, there are some people who do not have any mental problems in the past and are now behaving like mad people. Some people who were very able, who were hardworking and no longer able to do what they used to do. They're like wasted in trading centers. There are some people who have given up in life. They live as their spirit have deserted them. There are people who are secluded and they keep to themselves alone, even if they were not like that before. That is what I'm observing as a result of trauma which people are living with. Some of the community members lost so many people, and they do not know what to do. The study also demonstrated that this increased level of disability affects the well-being not only of individuals, but the household as a whole. Victims surveyed had an average of 2 disabled members, compared with 0.5 in the general population, contributing to a high average of proportions of dependents per household, 70% in the victim population, compared to 47% in the general population. All this makes it a higher problem because there's lack of treatment and support service. The various forms of harm suffered by the victims have not yet been adequately addressed by the provisions of appropriate services. This lack of support for victims is a significant negative factor in their ability to recover from trauma. In other contexts, professional treatment could be used to fill this void until victims are recovered sufficiently to build new relationships and rebuild existing ones. However, the victims' community have largely been deprived of psychosocial treatment services. The victim expert witness study showed that the victim population continued to suffer significant barriers to accessing health services. They require significantly more time than members of the general population to access a health center and are less likely to obtain the treatment that they require when they get there. Mental health treatment and psychosocial support services are still desperately needed in the victims' community. The lack of mental services is mirrored by an inadequacy of resources to allow the victims' community to undertake traditional rituals, which would have assisted them in recovery. This is directly linked with the loss of livestock. Such rituals are able to alleviate the problem of Chen. Traditional rituals are also necessary upon the death of a community member, and if not performed, problems for family and communities may result, as before explained. And I quote, "Cultural practices require that you should find these animals to use for rituals. For example, if someone was raped in the bush and there is need to use a goat to carry out a ritual of cleanse this person, because if you don't cleanse it, the person may get mad or may not bear children or may actually die. You have to look for a goat so that ritual is conducted and the person is cleansed. But there are no goats. They were taken. The crimes have also had consequences in the collapse of community social structure. As B3 said, there is a collective sense of suffering and hopelessness. And that attack left a lot of bitterness in the people of Odek. Even up to now, if you go for a meeting in Odek, you will find more women than men because most of men died. Some were abducted and some never returned up to now. People are not sure whether they are still alive or no longer. Some people are still missing their children. All the school-going children were abducted and their parents are still missing them. People are very embittered, but there's nothing else they can do. So they are carrying on with life. Whereas in the past the community valued and were seen as a solution to problem, the experience of the attacks led some people to fear community life and instead seek isolation. And I quote again, "In the past, people would come together like in a cooperative society to do things together in community. They would go farming together. They would have a lot of activities that was done communally. But with what took place, people fear coming together. They fear that when you are found living together, they will finish you like they finished people in the past. And they fear that when you are like 5 or 10, you can all be taken. Social support structures which existed before have been eroded. Dependency on aid was created. Young people began to lose their sense of cultural practice and respect for the elders. Ethnic identity and practices were corroded. Alcohol and other substance abuse used increasingly, and also did the levels of crime. Violence, including domestic violence, has increased. Young men expected to provide for families are without any means of income and turn instead to social destructive behavior. I'm quoting from PCB 2. Traditions relating to succession and loan ownership were undermined. The children of girls and women abducted in the LRA could not inherit lands, and these families would then have no land to work. These are the long-lasting consequences of the crimes that your honors are here to judge. I would like to finalize with the victims' experience of the trial and their expectations of justice. Your honors, victims have followed closely the proceedings. They have attended in large numbers to the screenings when such viewings have been provided. They travel huge distances to meet with our team, probably with Ms. Maceda's team too, to be informed about what is happening in the proceedings. They are grateful. This is the only justice they will get for the horrendous crimes they have suffered. This is the only kind of formal proceeding where many of the dual status witnesses and the victims that were allowed to give evidence have had the chance to tell their story in a formal setting. They see this act of giving statement before this court as the beginning of the healing process. This opportunity has enabled some victims to contribute to the truth about the LRA attacks on IDP camps in Odek, Lukodi, and Abok. For most of the victims, the opportunity given by the court to be represented by the lawyers in the proceedings, to express their views, their concerns, and convey their questions has been a first of its kind for them and is greatly appreciated. However, despite the unprecedented scope of charges brought by the prosecution against Mr. Dominic Ongwen, the evidence presented by the prosecution did not fully portray and totally portray the suffering of the victims. Some of the more grievous forms of torture and humane treated meted out by some LRA rebel fighters were not shown. During the course of the engagement with our clients, several victims opened up and conveyed to us that rape occurred also during the attack against both male and female members of the community. Evidence presented by the prosecutions confirmed this view. Witness 187 testified how she was raped by an LRA fighter in the aftermath of a Lukodi attack. She was abducted, forced to carry looted items, raped by the LRA fighter, and released. The LRBs would like to therefore emphasize that the harm suffered by victims goes far beyond the material presented by the prosecution. The participating victims we represent know that whilst they have been fortunate to meaningfully participate in these proceedings, they are aware that many others were not given the same opportunity because of the time limits set by this court. Finally, Your Honors, victims in the community, as previously stated, thought this day would never come. They have put faith in these proceedings and in this court. They have seen the evidence presented before Your Honors and believe it's compelling and that should result in a conviction on all charges. This conviction, Your Honors, will be the first step towards reconciliation among the communities and the reparation of the harm they suffered as individuals, but also as communities. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. Thank you, Mr. Manoba. We will have now a break. We can permit ourselves a little bit a longer break until 11:30, and then we continue with Ms. Maceda, I assume, and you switch rows, I also assume, till then.
All rise.